Today's daf is daf Yud Ches, and we're going to start with V'Savar Rabbi Yehuda. What we know is that according to Rabbi Yehuda, both Rabbi Lazar and the Chachamim have an issue with regard to a person who does the shchita, the korban, on the condition that the dam would be for tomorrow. And that's called lahaniach. Laniach, to leave over some of the dam until the next day, and Rabbi Yehuda holds that in this issue, both Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim agree that it's possible. And the question is why he says such a thing. The Gemara actually, as we saw, applies the principle of Gzera Miktsas Domo Atakol Domo, that if he leaves over part of the dam, that was his intention, he might come to leave over all of the dam. And that would be a psul doraisa, which the Gemara proves from a brisa, which records a conversation between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim, in which case the Chachamim were approached by Rabbi Yehuda. And Rabbi Yehuda says, don't you agree that if he would leave over the dam till tomorrow, it should passel the korban? Certainly agree to that. And therefore, it follows that whether or not he actually left the dam over for tomorrow, or he chishev, right? He had the intention to leave over the dam, it should be possible. So it comes out that the way we have it here, the Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda say that Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanon both agree that if he has an intention to leave over the dam for tomorrow, then the korban is possible. The Tanakama, according to Rabbi Yehuda, would say that the way Rabbi Yehuda says it, that even the Tanakama would say it's possible, and Rabbi Lazar came to say that even in this case, Rabbi Lazar argues with the Chachamim, and the Chacham are the ones who are saying that it's kosher. So the bottom line is, for our purposes for today's shir, or part one of today's shir in any event, is that according to Rabbi Lazar, both Rabbi Eliezer, again, it gets confusing because Rabbi Lazar is the Amora and Rabbi Eliezer is the Tana, but both Rabbi Eliezer, according to Rabbi Yehuda, both Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim agree that if he shechts the animal for the purpose of leaving over some of the dam for tomorrow, it's possible. Had he left over all the dam, it would be possible doraisa. Because he left over part of the dam, it's only possible d'Rabbanon. Whereas Rabbi Lazar holds that this issue of a person who wants to leave, his intention at the time of the shechita was to leave over the dam for tomorrow, but only part of the dam, that is a subject of machlokes tanoim between Rabbi Eliezer, who passes the korban, and Chachamim, who are machshir the korban. So the way we're interpreting the brisa, Rabbi Lazar and Rabbi Yehuda, they don't disagree whether, according to Rabbi Eliezer, when he has this machshava at the time of the shechita to eat something, like, for example, to eat the komets, which is meant to be burnt on the mizbeach, that's called davar she'ein ein darko lechol, or he has in mind at the time of the haktorah to be maktir the shirayim, which is a davar she'darko lechol v'lo darko lahaktir. And in the sheet of Rabbi Eliezer, when he has that machshava of shalo darko, whether it's shalo darko lechol in the case of komets, or ein darko lahaktir in the case of the shirayim, in both we have a only an issue about whether it's posel dorais or posel d'Rabbanan, And now the Gemara says, this is where we want to start today. V'sover Rabbi Yehuda lo haniach midam l'mocha divrei kol pasul. Is it really so, says the Gemara, that according to Rabbi Yehuda, which we saw on the top of the Omud, if his kavanah at the time of the shechita was to leave the dam over for tomorrow, everybody agrees that it's possible, both Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim. Vasanya, what do we do with the following brisa? Omar Rebbe. Now, this entire brisa is going to put us back a little bit into the history of who Rebbe was and so forth. Omar Rebbe. Kishalachti lematzos midosai etzel Rebbe Elazar ben Shamua. The word lematzos comes from the word mitzui. Mitzui is when you extract the main point. And midosai was, how to learn the Torah. And this implies that Rebbe was a Talmud of Rebbe Elazar ben Shamua. Elsewhere, the Gemara seems to assume he was not a Talmud, but here he was a Talmud, because maybe this is referring to a later period of Rebbe's life. And he went to get the mitzui of the Midos HaTorah from his Rebbe Elazar ben Shamua. The Amrile, according to another transmission, it was Lamatzos Midosov Shel Rebbe Elazar ben Shamua. In other words, not just a mitzui of midosai, but also of the midos of Rebbe Elazar ben Shamua. In other words, he wanted to learn from Rebbe Elazar all the knowledge that he, Rebbe Elazar ben Shamua, had beyond the knowledge of Rebbe, anything in the increment. And Rebbe says, Matzasi Yosef Abavli Yosef Lefanov. I encountered Yosef Abavli, who is a Talmud of Rebbe Elazar ben Shamua. V'hayachaviv lo biyoser ad li achas. Now there are a whole bunch of different interpretations of what ad li achas means. But what's common to all these different interpretations, you have Rashi and Tosfos quotes the Megillah Star of Rabbeinu Nisim. All of them agree that what Yosef Abavli was saying was that he found the Torah of Rebbe Elazar ben Shamua chaviv olav biyoser. It was very, very beloved to him. And maybe biyoser means to the ultimate level, or the way Tosfos quotes it, ad ma'od. Amalo. So now the Brisa is quoting a testimony of Rebbe regarding a conversation, a dialogue between Rav Yosef Habavli and his Rebbe Elazar ben Shamua. Amalo. So Yosef Habavli says to Rebbe Elazar ben Shamua, Rebbe, Hashochet es hazevach laniach midam l'mocher ma'u. What's the din about the validity or the lack thereof of the carbon if his machshava at the time of the shechita was to leave over the dam until the next day? Amalo kosher. So this happened during the afternoon. Arvis in the evening. Once again, Yosef Habavli repeats his question to Rebbe Elazar ben Shamua, Amalo kosher. Again, he repeats the answer, kosher. Shachris Amalo kosher. The next morning, he asks his Rebbe Elazar ben Shamua, what's the deal? If he shechts the carbon laniach domo, and he says kosher, and so Rayim Amalo kosher. And now he's gone through an entire 24-hour cycle, repeating the same question over and over again, getting the same answer over and over again. Again, as we'll see later on, what's bothering Yosef Habavli is that he had some sort of a tradition that Hashochet Zevach Laniach Dama L'Mocher is possible. But yet his Rebbe Rebbe Elazar ben Shmuel consistently repeats that it's kosher. Mincha Amarlo, but finally he breaks through, so to speak. Yosef Abavli breaks through with his Rebbe Rebbe Elazar ben Shmuel, and Rebbe Elazar ben Shmuel all of a sudden says kosher Elish Rabbi Eliezer posel. And this was what Yosef Abavli was waiting for Rebbe Elazar ben Shmuel to add the word Rabbi Eliezer Omer posel, meaning it's not universally accepted that the korban is kosher. And so Tolupanav Shal Yosef Abavli. Yosef Abavli breaks out in a gigantic smile. He's very happy. Omer lo. So Elazar ben Shmuel says to him, Yosef, kimeduma ani shelo shekivanenu shmuosenu ad ato. I mean, until this point, you didn't break out in joy. What is it that all that I taught you until now was not was not exciting? All of a sudden, you get inspired. Omalo Rebbe Hain. The truth is that everything that you told me until now is consistent with the halacha. But Ella, Sherab Yehuda Posel Shanuli. My Rebbe, before I came to learn by you, Rabbi Elazar ben Shmuel, was Rabbi Yehuda, and he told us, Rabbi Yehuda, that posel, that the korban is posel. V'chazarti al kol talmidov, ubikashti li chaver v'lo matzasi. I made a round amongst all the talmidim of Rabbi Yehuda, and nobody confirmed what I had heard from Rabbi Yehuda, namely that the question about a zvicha al menas laniach es dama l'machar is possible. Nobody was willing to entertain the possibility, as I knew from Rabbi Yehuda, that there is a dea, there is an opinion of Rabbi Eliezer that the korban is possible. Achshav, but now that you, Rabbi Elazar ben Shmuel, have told me, Shanisa li possible, but you told me that there is a shita of Rabbi Eliezer who holds that the korban is possible, is Chazarta li avidasi. That which I thought was lost, meaning Rashi says, I thought I was forgetting my Torah. I realized, no, I didn't forget my Torah. And that in fact, there is a dissenting view of Rabbi Eliezer against the Chacham who holds that in this case it's possible. And Zolgu Ein of Tmo Shel Rabbi Elazar ben Shmuel. Rabbi Elazar ben Shmuel was, when he saw how moved and how inspired and how his Talmud Yosef Abavli was celebrating over the fact that finally someone confirmed that he had, that he had not forgotten, but that he remembered his Torah. He was so moved by that the Rebbe, I'm talking about Rabbi Elazar ben Shmuel, that he started crying out of joy. Why? Because Ashreichem Talmidei Chachamim shedivrei Torah chavivin aleim biyoser. It's clearly demonstrated to him how much love, how the Talmidei Chacham find the Torah so beloved to them that Yosef Abavli would break out with such a smile because he realized that he was right and he didn't forget his Torah. And Karlov al Mikra Zeh, Rabbi Elazar ben Shmuel quoted a pasuk in Tehillim, a very well-known pasuk, and applied it to Yosef Abavli. Ma hafti sorasecha kol yom yisichasi. How much I love the Torah. Now, we said in the name of Rabbi Yehuda, who was Yosef Abavli's original Rebbe, that the korban is possible. Hamipneisha Rabbi Yehuda beno shel Rabbi Loi Talmido shel Rabbi Elazar. Lefichach shana lecha mishnas Rabbi Eliezer. Okay, now we have a little piece of history of the Masoras HaTorah, and Rabbi Yehuda is the son of Rabbi Eloi. Rabbi Eloi, in turn, is a Talmud of Rabbi Eliezer. And therefore, Rabbi Yehuda, as the son of Rabbi Eloi, the Talmud of Rabbi of Rabbi Eliezer would teach us that the carbon is possible. Now, what do you mean the carbon is possible? The Rabbanan hold the carbon is kosher. It means the majority of the Chachamim were machshir the carbon. So why is it that Rabbi Eliezer taught that the carbon is possible? That's only a minority view. And therefore, Rabbi Yehuda, as the son of Rabbi Eloi and the Talmud of Rabbi Eliezer, taught you, and that's what you had originally heard from Yehuda, that the carbon is possible, but that's a minority view, and that's only the view of Rabbi Eliezer. So you were getting filtered down the Torah of Rabbi Eliezer through your Rabbi Yehuda, your Rabbi Yehuda, but Rabbi Yehuda in turn was giving you the Torah of Rabbi Eliezer, who was the Rebbe of his father. So that's the end of the brisa. Now the Gemara is gonna raise a problem with the brisa. So just to summarize, what Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua is telling his Talmud Yosef Abavli is that what you had heard from your Frierdiker Rebbe, Rabbi Yehuda, that it's possible, the carbon is possible, that was because Rabbi Yehuda was giving you over the Torah of Rabbi Eliezer, who was his father's Rebbe. Frek the Gemara, if that which Yosef Abavli soaked up from his Rebbe, Rabbi Yehuda, was that everybody agrees that the carbon is possible, is then why does Yosef Ababli express such exhilaration with regard to what he heard from Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua, his second Rebbe, when in fact what he knew from Rabbi Yehuda, his first Rebbe, was that everybody agrees it's possible. And now Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua told him time after time after time that the carbon is kosher, except on the last occasion he invokes the shita of Rabbi Eliezer as a dissenting view. But certainly what Yosef Ababli was hearing now was not Hichzar Tolias Avidasi, because Hichzar Tolias Avidasi would mean if everybody agreed that the carbon is possible. But that's not where Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua was teaching him. Iu Plukta Kamerle. Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua was transmitting to his Talmud, Yosef Abavli, that the issue here about a Kohen who at the time of the Shechita has in mind that some of the dam should be left for tomorrow, and Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua says the carbon is basically kosher. That's how we're going to pass, like the majority view. There is one dissenting view of Rabbi Eliezer, but why would Yosef Abavli get so excited about that when his tradition from his Rebbe, Rabbi Yehuda, was that everybody agrees that the carbon is possible? And the Gemara says, Elamai kosher Rabbi Eliezer posel asnei. Perhaps we would suggest that the original Mesiras HaTorah from the first Rebbe, from Rabbi Yehuda to Yosef Abavli, was that the carbon itself is kosher, but Rabbi Eliezer passes the carbon. Ihachi mai ha mipnei. Right, Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua says that since, right, he has this whole tradition that Rabbi Yehuda is a son to Rabbi Eloi, who is a Talmud of Rabbi Eliezer. Is ananami plukta komas nisid. Basically, if you're going to tell me that what Rabbi Yehuda had taught, and Yosef Abavli learned from his Rebbe Rabbi Yehuda, was that there is a machlokes here between the Chacham and Rabbi Eliezer about this point, then what's this whole business where Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua says that all the Torah that you got from Rabbi Yehuda about this issue was because Rabbi Yehuda, etc., etc. Forget about that. I mean, Rabbi Elazar ben Shmuel is just reiterating exactly what tradition was passed on to Rabbi Yehuda. I'm sorry, from Rabbi Yehuda to Yosef HaBavli. So basically, it comes out that Rabbi Elazar ben Shmuel is actually just repeating what Yosef HaBavli heard from Rabbi Yehuda. El Oliolim Divrei Kol Posel Asne. We're going to have to say that what Yosef HaBavli heard from his Rebbe, Rabbi Yehuda, was that according to everyone, the carbon is possible. And now it's very strange because Rabbi Elazar ben Shmuel was telling him that everybody holds that the carbon is kosher, until finally Rabbi Elazar ben Shmuel reveals that Rabbi Eliezer disagrees and he passes the carbon. Umay hichzarto liavidasi. In other words, although it's true that what Yosef HaBavli had absorbed from his Rebbe, Rabbi Yehuda, that everybody agrees that the korban is possible, but nevertheless, I never, says Yosef HaBavli, found anyone who could confirm that there's even an opinion out there, the possibility that the korban is possible. So therefore, Hichzartu li avidasi, once Rabbi Elazar ben Shmuel added that extra word that there's a dissenting view of Rabbi Eliezer who holds that the korban is possible, is finally I understood, says Yosef HaBavli, that there's someone out there in the Welt that holds that the korban is possible. Until now, everybody was telling me when I went around to the Talmidim and I encountered them, they all told me unanimously that nobody argues and the korban is kosher. And I knew that I heard from Rabbi Yehuda, my Rebbe, that the korban, according to Rabbi Eliezer at least, is possible. Now you are confirming, Rabbi Elazar ben Shmuel is now confirming what I couldn't confirm, says Yosef Abba, because I tried with every Talmud that I met, and nobody gave me an inkling of an idea that there's a dissenting view and some Tana out there who holds that the korban is possible. The Mishnah says, Lo yotzak, lo balal, lo pasas, lo molach, lo henif, lo higish, o shepsasan pitim merubos, lo mashachan, kshera. So this Mishnah enumerates an entire list of avodas hamincha to determine, or shall I say, to teach us which of those avodos, and we'll soon see that they came before the Kmitza, which of those avodos are only lechatchila, right? In other words, they should be done, but kshera, if they weren't done, then the mincha is still valid. So let's try to go one by one. The first item in the Mishnah is yitzika. Right? Yitzika means that a korban mincha starts with flour, kemach, and then you add a log shemen. So the shemen is added to the solus, to the flour. When you add the oil to the flour, that's called yitzika. In fact, there was more than one yitzika because they first put the oil into the flour, then after it got absorbed a little bit, they added more shemen and did another yitzika, and finally did a third yitzika. But again, the Mishnah is establishing that lo yotzak, kshera, the mincha is still kshera even without the yitzika. Now, there's something called matan shemen bekli. We didn't mention that before. And that is that the shemen is put into an empty kli shares to be makadish the shemen. Then the kemach is poured into the shemen that's already been poured into the kli. Afterwards, they add more shemen, right? So that's a second yitzik of shemen. At that point, they mix everything together, which is called belila, which we're going to get to in a minute. And after the second application of the shemen, then you have now a taroves because you did belila and you mixed it all together. You add another yitzik. There's another yitzik of shemen, and that's based on the pasuk v'yotzak oleha shemen. Now, Rashi seems to assume that the Yitzika that we're talking about here in our Mishnah is that third Yitzika. Now, not every mincha requires shemen. I mean, we're talking about a minchas soles, a minchas machvas, a minchas marcheshes. There are other menachos that don't require shemen at all, but we're talking about those that require shemen. Now, here there's a gigantic issue. How do we interpret the words lo yotzak? Does that mean that there was no yitzik at all? And yet the minchas kshera without any yitzik? I mean, the Torah says v'yotzak oleh shemen, and that appears more than once in the Torah. We have a principle in Kodshim, we're going to get to it soon on Daf Chav, that kol mokum shonak lava kosiv is likuva, that whenever the Torah says it twice, it's ma'akiv, it's critical. So how could the mincha be ksher without any yitzik at all? So here we have a shita that we'll find in the Bartanura, and I'm not sure about the Rambam, but I think even the Rambam holds this way, that what the Mishnah means by lo yotzak, not that there was no yitzik at all, the Mishnah means lo yotzak kohen elazar. A non-kohen did the yitzika. Now we're going to see later on in the Gemara in Amid Beis that the Chachamim hold that since the yitzika came before the kmitza, the requirement of a kohen is not critical, and even a non-kohen could perform that which prepares and preliminaries the final kmitza. So before we get to the kmitza, we got yitzika and a couple of other things that we're going to see right now in the Mishnah, and those lechatchila require kohen, but it's not critical. So you could have yitzika by a zar, and that's called lo yotzak. Lo yotzak kohen el zar. Lo bolal. Right, we said that after the log shemen is poured into the klishares, then we add the kamach, and then we have to do belila, and we have to mix it all together. So the Gemara, as we'll soon see on Amid Beis, is going to invoke the famous principle of Reb Zera, which we'll see. We'll wait till we get there. I'll leave you in suspense. And the belila, once again, we're going to have a whole issue here. What do you mean lo bolal? I mean, there was no belila at all? I mean, the Torah requires belila. So some are going to say lo bolal kohen elazar. And again, applying the principle that we mentioned before of mikmitza v'elach, that anything that came before kmitza does not require kahuna, at least not likuva, and therefore this belila was done by a zar, by a non-kohen. And pashtus would be that the same would apply if, let's say, it was a kohen balmum. So there was a belila, and the Torah requires belila, but it was not implemented by a kohen. Okay. Now we get to posas. Posas means that you break apart the mincha into smaller pieces. And that facilitates the kmitza. So the Torah says, pasos osa pitim, break the mincha into pieces. Now that pasuk appears in the parsha of Minchas Machvas, but it's going to apply to any of the menachos that are baked in an oven. And all the menachos that are baked in an oven, for example, Minchas Machvas, Minchas Maseches, that baking in the oven is before kmitza. Now, the halacha is that before kmitza, after you bake it in the oven, again, minchas mafer, then the menachos are broken up into pieces. Right? We start with 10 loaves, and then we break them up into pieces, and then we do a kmitza. So if, let's say, he didn't do the kmitza, so here we have to know a Gemara on Ayin Hey. A lot of what we're doing here is on Ayin Dalet Ayin Hey. But what we have on Daf Ayin Hey is that when it says lo pasas in our Mishnah and it's kshera, it means that he only did the psisa on a minimal level. And he broke up the mincha sufficiently to take a kometz. But once again, if there was no psis at all, then it would seem like the mincha is psula. So now lo pasas, we have two interpretations. Either lo pasas might mean that he only broke the mincha into enough pieces to facilitate the kometz, the kmitza. And he didn't break up the mincha into smaller parts, but he did do a psisa. Or alternatively, it means that a non-Kohen did the psisa. Then we get to velo molach. And the Torah again requires in a korban mincha that before the haktar of the korban mincha, you have to place salt onto the korban mincha. And this is based on a pasuk in Vayikra Perik Beis. Right, the kometz requires haktar al gabi mizbeach, but first you have to put the salt before the burning of the kometz. Again, we get into a major controversy here with the Rambam, with Tosas Yontif, from Kiveger, Sfas Emes. Everybody gets involved in this issue, and they're saying that the Torah requires adding salt to the melech before the kometz is burnt. If you didn't do so, you'll get malchus for violating a lav in the Torah. But the Mishnah says that even though you get malchus for violating this lav because of the absence of salting, nevertheless the korban still remains kosher. Next, below Hanif, all right, this is referring to the Minchas HaOmer that's brought on the second day of Pesach, and it requires Tnufa, and he didn't do the Tnufa. Lo Hegish. Okay, now this has to do, this Hagosh, I think we've had it in the past, that before the Kmitza, the Mincha requires Hagosha, right? We place the Mincha into a Kli Shares, and then it comes in contact with the Drom Maravi corner of the Mizbeach. So the Mishnah is telling us that this Hagasha, in which the Klisharis that's containing the Mincha is brought to the southwestern corner of the Mizbeach, this Hagasha, which is again before the Kmitza, is not Likuva, and even in the absence of Hagasha, the Mincha is Kshera. Another case with regard to Psisa is Osha Psasam Pitim Merubos. The Mincha has to be broken into smaller pieces in order to prepare for the Kmitza, but he broke it into larger pieces. Then we get to Lo Meshachan, right? The Torah, in certain cases of a mincha that requires rikikin, right? Those are the oven-baked menachos, have to be smeared with oil after the baking. And the Mishnah rules that even if the smearing is neglected, the mincha remains valid. The Gemara says, "My lo yotzak." If it means in the Mishnah that the minchas ksher, even though there was lo yitzika, that's impossible because he kuva ksivba. Because with regard to yitzika, the Torah repeats itself twice to teach us that a mincha without yitzika, if there was no oil poured onto the kometz, onto the kemach, is psula. There's no question about it. So you can't tell me that lo yotzak means lo yotzak klal. And these two psukim appear in Vayikra Perik Beis, the opening pasuk, and if you fast forward to pasuk Vav, and the Gemara is going to establish on the next Amud here, on Daf Yutes, a very famous Gemara, that if the Shinak Olavakos is Likuva, so Yitzika for sure is critical. Elo, says the Gemara, Lo Yotzak Kohen Elazar. Like we said before, in the Shita the Chachamim, if there are avodos that were performed before the Kmitza, they don't require a Kohen. And therefore, since Yitzika is before the Kmitza, if a Zar implemented the Yitzika, the Minchas Kshera. Ihachi, says the Gemara, if you're telling me that we're talking in the Mishnah about a case where the oil was poured by a non-Kohen, is lo bolol nami, let's be consistent. Later on, the Gemara is going to reject this, but right now the Gemara is holding, let's be consistent, and we'll interpret lo bolol nami, lo bol kohen elazar. Now, whenever you say the words lo ex elazar, that X was not performed by a Kohen, but rather by a Zar, you're telling me that if it wasn't performed at all, neither by a Kohen nor by a Zar, then it's psula. And that's what we saw in the case of Yitzika. That lo yotzak kshera means lo yotzak Kohen el Zar, but if there was no Yitzika at all, then shana lava kosev likuva, it's so critical, the Yitzika, that it would undermine the kashrus of the korban, of the mincha. Now we're going to apply the same yardstick to Belila, because we're saying that lo balal in our Mishnah means lo balal Kohen ela Zar, implying that if there was no Belila at all, there was no mixing, then the mincha would be psula. And now we're going to get into that whole sugya about Reb Zera that I was leaving in suspense, and that'll be on Amud Beis.